So there's now about 300 of us, and they are people who have either been bereaved or seriously injured in terror attacks, either on UK citizens overseas or on any citizens in the UK. So that network ranges from people who lost loved ones in IRA bombings back in the 1970s through to the most recent, some of the most recent attacks. And what that group is about is really trying to do two things. One, to make sure that survivors get the rights and support that they deserve and that we would expect them to get, but also trying to work as a group of people to make terrorism less impactful and less successful. If you've been through something like we all have, what that does is it gives you this deep and abiding sense that you want to make sure that terrorism doesn't succeed in its objectives. So those are the two things that we spend our time trying to influence.
The face of the terrorist in Liverpool is splashed on most front pages today. What's your response to that? How does that make you feel?
What we know from the evidence is that one of the reasons that these attacks happen isn't just ideological. Sometimes it is, but it isn't normally just ideological. It's also personal. And that one of the personal motivations for these people that commit these horrific attacks is for notoriety, is for fame, is for significance. That in a lot of cases, these individuals had either troubled lives or very lonely and isolated lives where they didn't feel that they had the recognition. One of the reasons that they'd often join extremist networks is for that sense of connection and belonging within that extremist group. And then a key desire is for that moment of wider recognition. They want that notoriety. They want to be famous. The reason that they take part in these attacks, as I say, is not just ideological. It's that desire for personal notoriety. So we might think that when we are putting their faces on our front pages, that is demonstrating how awful they are, but it is exactly playing into their hands. It is what they want. And again, as families who have been bereaved or as families who have survived terror attacks, the key thing that we want to do is to make sure that terrorism is less effective, that we don't play into their hands. And I think all too often in the media coverage, we put their names out. Sometimes we publish their manifestos. Sometimes we even publish their videos with IS, Islamic State, for example. Their videos that they were putting out about people being beheaded or people being burnt to death, these horrific videos, we were then sharing, perhaps, blacked out at critical moments, but we were doing their job of propaganda for them. And I think it's time that we stopped that. The media organisations took those basic steps. Now, of course, there is the completely legitimate public interest. People have a right to know what happened, why it happened, what we know about it. But that's different than playing into the hands of terrorists by sharing their ideology, by dividing our communities and giving those individual terrorists the notoriety that they crave.
Professor Chris Frost, the chair of the Ethics Council of the National Union of Journalists, has said while the NUJ, the National Union of Journalists, is sympathetic to the survivors' concern, many of the report's recommendations, because you produced a report last month, I believe, many of the report's recommendations are unrealistic and a danger to freedom of speech. How do you respond to that?
We've had lots of very, very positive response. I'm not sure that the NUJ always speak for all of their members. We've had really positive reactions from existing editors, from former editors. Former editor of The Sun, for example, was on the Today programme talking about that report and saying it is time that we change some of these practices. And of course, we're not calling for limits on freedom of speech at all. We're not calling for this to be the law, that it to be illegal. What we are calling for is for journalists to use their judgment about when do you move from informing the public about what happened into sharing and promoting ideology. When do you move from telling people why something happened into giving that person the notoriety? So, of course, we're not suggesting for a second that these attacks aren't reported on. It's absolutely critical that they are, but that's not the same as putting their faces on the front pages of our newspapers day after day. That is what they want, and at the moment, it is what we're doing, and that can change. It's not a breach of press freedom for journalists to make that editorial decision. And in fact, if you look at several cases recently, if you look at the high-profile murder case recently, what happened there was that people decided to stop naming the former police officer who committed that attack. In New Zealand, you had the Prime Minister following the attack, horrific attack on a couple of mosques there, again making the same decision not to name that individual, not to keep repeating their names. Similarly, in the US, you've got CNN making the judgment not to name the killers or the shooters in school shootings because, again, of that personal notoriety. Le Monde are now doing the same in France. So this is something which media organisations are already thinking about. Some are already moving on, and we think there are ways of doing that in a way which still enables journalists to do their job, their vital job of informing the public, reporting on these things that are in the public interest, but aren't promoting the terrorist ideology and aren't giving them the notoriety that they crave.
Let's go back to your own experience of being a survivor, your own terrible loss. You are in shock. You are in grief in the immediate days after your loss, after the murder of your loved one. You're worrying about your children. Do you also have 1,000 media outlets getting in touch wanting to interview you?
Yes, and the reality is on this that in those first... So we did this survey and we asked survivors if they had experienced any media intrusion. Over 60% of people said that they had, and the vast majority of that happened within the first 48 hours. And if you imagine in that first 48 hours, you're in the process of telling your loved ones that your partner or your brother or sister or whoever it is has died. You are in the middle of identifying their bodies. In some cases, you're waiting for news from the hospital about whether they are going to make it or not. And in that context, to have people constantly knocking on your door or messaging you through social media or calling you up, individually as a journalist, you might not think that that has much impact. But if you are getting call after call after call, I was speaking to somebody who lost their child in the Manchester Arena attack. And while they were waiting for a call from the police to let them know whether their loved one was safe or not, had been caught up and ultimately died in the attack, they were getting call after call from withheld numbers. And so they were answering every single one of those calls, hoping it was their child calling them from the hospital, hoping that it was the police with good news. And every time it was a journalist. Now, that's not about journalists being evil or nasty, but it is about a system which creates such a huge amount of volume that for the individuals involved, it becomes oppressive. The taxi driver in the attack that we've just been hearing about in Liverpool has already called on media organisations to stop intruding. They had, I think, people knocking on their door at 10 o'clock at night, and that's not respectful of those individuals and what they're having to go through. And yes, of course, those individuals should have the right to tell their story, and journalists, of course, should be able to contact them. But why not, one of the recommendations we made in the report, why not have a 48-hour period where there is that opportunity just for those people who are going through hell to be able to collect their thoughts and pull themselves together and to look after their family? And
finally, David Amos's funeral is next week. That must bring back terrible memories of your own loss. How do we stop another family suffering in the way that yours and David Amos's have, both murdered, attending a constituency surgery?
Yeah, when I heard about David's killing, it obviously brought everything back for our family and for my kids, and just the horror of what they're going through and will still be going through. I said at the time that the public response to things really does matter. In our case, in the aftermath around Joe's funeral, my son was in the car as we were on the way to on the way to the funeral, and there were thousands of people lining the route and throwing flowers onto the car. And he said, I knew that people love Mummy, but I didn't realise that this many people did. And that has a soothing effect on those people that are going through that pain and that grief. But also then, if you take it, that's something that we can all be part of doing. The broader role that we can all play, I think, is to make terrorism less successful, to not do what terrorists want. Because if we make it less successful and less impactful, then less people will do it because it's less of a viable strategy. So that means when they want to divide us, we should pull together. Their strategy is to turn community against community. If you're advocating for that, if you're driving that, if you're blaming all right-wingers for the attack on Joe, if you're blaming all Muslims for the attack on David Amis, you are doing what terrorists want you to do. And the media organisations, if you are giving them that infamy, if you are sharing their image of you, putting that on the front pages every day, again, you are falling into what they want you to do. If you are sharing their ideology and explaining what it was they wanted this attack to achieve, then again, you're in the position of making terrorism more successful. So there are things that all of us as individuals can do, and none of that will do, the amazing work of the security services and the police in stopping individual attacks. But what it can do is in the margins shift the balance and make terrorism less successful, less impactful, and therefore we hope over time something that occurs less and less, so that fewer families have to go through what mine have and what David Amos's have and what many others, unfortunately, across our country have.
Brendan Cox, founder of Survivors Against Terror. Thank you very much indeed for talking to us today. Thank you.